Hello, I'm Dan Gibson. In this video, we're going to briefly examine which approach I am taking to Islam. Now, some years ago, Fred Donor published Narratives of Islamic Origins. Fred Donor was not his real name. His real name was Dr. Peter Ritzma, professor of Near Eastern History in the Oriental Institute and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. That aside, Dr. Ritzma described 4 different approaches to Islam that are popular today. This idea caught on, and it seemed that many scholars and readers of Islam are trying to squeeze each other into one of these 4 different categories. I face this all the time when people call me a revisionist, and they group me with Dr. Patricia Crone and with other revisionists. Now, in his paper, Dr. Ritzma explains that his 4 categories concern opinions about what happened in the early period of Islam. This is from the time of the life of Muhammad. Since there are few available sources for this period, different opinions have come out, very often contradicting one another, and this has all emerged in the last few years. All of this Dr. Donor's paper was written back in 1998, before I published my findings, based on gathering archaeological data to add to that of the manuscripts. The first approach, Dr. Donor called it the descriptive approach. Now, this approach accepts and agrees with Islamic origins as related in traditional Muslim sources. This approach assumes that the Quran is the source for studying the life and the career of the Prophet Muhammad, and that the reports found in Islamic chronicles were basically reliable, and that the Hadith literature was generally reliable for sketching the history of Islam. Dr. Ritzma explains that in his 4-volume series, The Empire of the Arabs, John Glubb uses this descriptive approach. When he narrates Muhammad's birth and the story of him receiving revelation from the Archangel Gabriel as related in the traditional accounts. Glubb also uncritically relates how tribal leadership was contested by the Beni Hashim and the Beni Umayyah. Thus, John Glubb, this is an example of this approach, he reproduces narrative found within the Muslim tradition, which is consistent with this descriptive approach. Glubb's description of Islamic theology, such as the idea of one God, judgment, paradise, and hell, also suggests that he accepts the documentary nature of the Quran. In much the same way, I also identify with the descriptive approach. This is why, when people try to classify me in one of the other 3 groups, I resist them. They misunderstand what I'm saying because they cannot imagine that I equally hold to the descriptive approach and that Petra was the original holy city of Islam, not Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So, let's look at the other 3 approaches and see if I fit into any of those. The second group that Dr. Ritzma describes are what he calls the source-critical approach. This approach tries to formulate theories and methods to account for what they see as contradictions in the narratives. Dr. Ritzma lays it out like this. He says, number 1, the available accounts in the sources contain authentic early material, which was then meshed with unauthentic information. Now, I think I can go along with this, at least some ways. The second one is non-Islamic sources gave an independent account with which the Muslim narratives can be compared for reliability. Again, I struggle a bit here because the non-Islamic sources are far removed from the events that were happening. Third, Dr. Ritzma says, the Hadith literature was of little value in sketching Islamic history because of its religious interests. Now here I disagree completely. I think the Hadiths must be recognized in context, knowing who wrote them, why they were slanted in a particular way. Example, there are Shia and there are Sunni accounts, and also other influences that were going on, Umayyad and Abbasid and so forth. But I do not throw out the hadiths as being totally useless. Dr. Ritzma says the fourth one is the Quranic text is a documentary source for the period of Islamic origins. Now, in Muhammad at Mecca, that's Montgomery Watt, utilizes this source-critical approach when he questions whether the prominence of Muhammad's ancestors is credible or is a later exaggeration. He also notes how the sources written under the Abbasids tend to present the Umayyads in a negative light. This shows that Watt is critical of the sources and he is mindful of later unauthentic exaggerations which may have been added to actual historical information, a tendency which characterizes the source-critical approach. Watt, however, does not doubt the historical account as a whole, stating that there are no grounds for supposing serious falsification or large-scale invention. And this admission clearly places his method outside of the next one, the skeptical or the tradition-critical approaches. So I might fit into that category. So in the end, I might be classified as tradition-critical, except for the view of the hadiths. I don't accept all the hadiths at face value, but I accept them as records of people's thinking at the time when they were collected. Can you make that distinction? When Azraqi tells us that Noah's Ark circled the Kaaba 7 times before it landed, I accept that tradition as something that was being discussed at the time. Not that I actually accept that the Kaaba was around during the time of Noah, or that the Ark managed to circle 7 times around the Kaaba, or even that the people on the Ark could have seen the Kaaba if it was underwater. But I am glad that Azraqi records this because it was obviously a story that was going around during his day. So the hadiths have use, and I have studied them. And I've tried to find useful items that will help us understand the founding years of Islam. Now, while the source-critical approach produced many new studies and lots of people looking into things, the recognition of issues in oral transmission led to the emergence of a third approach to Islamic origin that Dr. Ritzma calls the tradition-critical approach. Dr. Ritzma tells us that this first was used in Goldzier's study of the Hadith literature. This approach holds that the traditional accounts were the product of evolution over time and reflected political and religious and social factors which became important after the time of the events, which the accounts describe. This approach acknowledges that large parts of the Muslim traditional literature may be fabrications, but assumes that the kernel of historical fact remains embedded within this literature and can be recovered by thorough analysis. In The Eye of the Beholder, Uri Rubin utilizes this tradition-critical approach in examining different versions of how the Annunciation story presented in the Shia sources, and he looks at those. Rubin also criticizes 2 versions of the story, which include Abu Bakr, and concludes these arise from later interpolations which reveal certain non-Shia motivations intended to support Abu Bakr's early conversion to Islam. Rubin's conclusion is that the traditional accounts were subject to gradual development and maybe changes based on political and theological factors. Now, some of that may be true, so do I fit into that? But certainly don't fit into the last one. That is those of source critical and traditional critical approaches. Some scholars began to question the very idea that there was any historical truth at all that had survived in Muslim tradition. Such concerns led to the formation of this fourth approach, which Dr. Ritzma terms the skeptical approach. This approach also holds that the traditional sources have undergone evolution, but denies the existence of any remaining historical truth, which could be indicated as reality or real events that actually occurred, because such evidence has been drowned out in the sea of later distortions. The assumption of the critical approach are, 1, the Quranic text wasn't closed or canonized until the 2nd or even the 3rd century Hijri. The second, the accounts of Islamic origin, which glorify the past, come from a later period. And third, the accounts describing the Prophet's life and were originally tied to the Quran itself as a form of exegesis. As an example, he refers to The Meccan Trade and Rise of Islam by Dr. Crony. She employs this skeptical approach in her analysis of the different versions of the Annunciation story about Muhammad in Syria, and remarks that evidently none of the 15 versions of the story can be true. Crony attributes these various accounts to storytellers, whom she says could produce equally fictitious accounts of an apparently historical incident. She concludes that the entire idea that Muhammad traded in Syria must have been untrue. Thus, Crony follows the skeptical approach in completely denying the existence of any historical truth in these narratives. Her approach to these stories is similar to those used by biblical criticism that denies the historicity of much of the Bible. I definitely do not agree with Dr. Crony on this point, and find almost nothing of common ground between my approach and that of the skeptical people who are denying this and denying that. So how would I describe my own approach to Islam? At this point in my studies, I believe that there was a real Muhammad in and about the time that Islamic history describes him. I think the histories could have been out by as much as 20 years, this way or that way. I accept this because there's always issues matching up one civilization's histories with another. I believe that Muhammad was born in a city known as Mecca, but that city was also had other names, including Rechem, Seir, Sila, and Petra. The later Islamic writers used the name of Mecca for both places, and in time their identities merged into one memory of one place rather than two. I believe that after the Black Rock was moved to Saudi Arabia, people started going to the Saudi location for pilgrimage, and in time the names of the places such as Mina, Arafat, Zamzam, Shib Abu Talib, and so forth were transferred from Petra to the location in Mecca. At first there were two pilgrimages. I think the manuscripts support that. But eventually the Petra location was destroyed by earthquakes, and also political correctness changed everything to the Mecca location. I also believe that places around Mecca were renamed, such as Ghadir Khum, Aqaba, Beidha, and even the village of Taif. I don't think this is too fantastic, because we see the very same thing happening in Christianity, where the holy sites were guessed at. And even today, I think the holy sites in Jerusalem are all in the wrong places, and the location of David and Solomon's temple, for instance, and the place of the crucifixion, and the location of the tomb are all later guesses that people made, and I don't think they got them right. If it happened to Christians, it could easily have happened in Islamic history. That doesn't mean the history is wrong. It just means that there was a period of time when the geography of those places wasn't as important as it was later. In Islam, it wasn't until Yakut came along that these location names were more or less cemented down. Now, as for the Quran, I think Muhammad did produce surahs. Many of them were circulated as individual documents. The challenge early Muslims had was to collect these individual documents and other things that people remembered Muhammad said, and to bring them all together into a conclusive single book. Abu Bakr tried it, Uthman then tried it, and I think it was done again by Hajjaj. The big issue in the collecting of these documents was that the collectors could add to the original collections new material that people believed were part of the original set, but weren't included. So the Quran grew in size. A second problem was that the destruction of anything that did not agree with their collection, thus wiping out most anything of the earlier collections. So am I a skeptical revisionist like Dr. Crony or like those on Sneakers Corner? Absolutely not. Am I a tradition critical revisionist like Goldziher? Definitely not. Am I a source critical edition like Glubb? Possibly, but I'm uncomfortable even in that box. Do I follow the descriptive approach? If I am limited to the 4 boxes that Dr. Rizma or Donor invented, then yes, I am most comfortable in that first box. It is the same box that 90% of traditional Muslims find themselves in. And yet, for the last 10 years or more, Muslims and even some Western scholars keep trying to cram me into one of the other boxes. Most are convinced that I am an absolute skeptic. But I am not. I describe myself as a literalist. I don't think that ancient chroniclers of history went about inventing history. I don't think they invented new characters or people. I think they tried to accurately write down what people were saying and thinking during their lifetime. Is it 100% accurate? Did they accurately reflect what really happened? I can't say how accurate they were, any more than I can say how accurate newspapers today are, with trained journalists and worldwide travel and instant communication. And yet, how accurately does our own media get what's happening? How influenced is the media today by what is politically correct? I don't expect any more or any less from the writers of Islamic history or the Hadiths. But they are useful in interpreting what the archaeological record tells us and getting a picture of what really happened in Arabia 1,500 years ago. I put my emphasis on the archaeological data of the mosques that I have looked at, the buildings I had looked at, and the Qiblas. I'm Dan Gibson. This has been another video in the series, Talking with Dan Gibson.